Bienvenidas, bienvenidos. We are in Lisbon, Portugal. They're calling it the Portuguese miracle, the highest standard of living in all of Europe. We're going to talk about Lisbon and Portugal, but first, this is Latina Literati. If you enjoy amazing stories, wonderful people from past and present, and great books, then this is the channel for you. We like to begin, as always, at the beginning. And so what do we know about the Iberian Peninsula? What do we know about Portugal, or its antique name, Lusitania? It is at least 400,000 years of human habitation. There have been skulls found and other remnants of Homo erectus, ancient man, that lived here almost 500,000 years ago. And modern humans have been here for at least 35,000 years. That's a long time. As we've spoken before about the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians that ruled the empire several thousands of years ago, ruled all of the Mediterranean. So of course, what we now know as Portugal and the whole Iberian Peninsula was part of the settlements and the trade that was controlled by Phoenicia and then Carthage. And it's several hundred years later that the Romans in the Second Punic War take over the settlements and the areas that had belonged to Carthage, the settlements that were part of the Carthaginian Empire in what is now Portugal. Interesting, because from the beginning, even before, we know that mining was crucial. There were lots of mines in Spain and Portugal. There were copper mines and pyrite mines, and that was really important for the making of different types of armaments. So just to think back about how we establish human development, it's unfortunately quite based on consumption. And so the most important things once you have metal making are not just metals, but also a lot of wood, because you have to keep fires going all the time in order to melt metal, in order to make metal into items that you use. So huge forests are just mowed down over the entire human history. And there's a direct parallel between development of human establishments and the complete deprivation of forests around those human settlements. And that, of course, happens in the Iberian Peninsula. So before you have the Romans entering, and before the Carthaginians, of course, you had the pre-Celtic peoples and the Celts that are coming down from the north. And then you have the Phoenicians and Carthaginians taking over, and then you have the Romans taking over. And it was called Galatia or Galicia in the north and Lusitania in the south. And of course, when Rome falls, then you have the Suebic kingdom, and you have also the Visigoth kingdoms come into play in the first millennia. And in about the 8th century, then you have the great Amazir, or as he was known, Berber general, Jebel al-Tariq, that comes with his North African armies and just sees how underpopulated the Visigoth kingdoms are, and quickly makes all of southern Iberian Peninsula part of the Umayyad Caliphate, what would become to be known as Al-Andalus, or the Caliphate of Cordoba, all names given to the Islamic part of the Iberian Peninsula, which included at least the southern part of Portugal for several hundred years. So in about 711, Jebel al-Tariq comes in, what is called the Reconquista, or the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula, and at least the Portuguese part of it doesn't happen until about 1245. So that's, or 500 years where you have a lot of Islamic architecture and you have a lot of waterworks and agriculture and all sorts of systems that are put in place. And you see it. You see it in the tiles and you see it in the handicrafts. And there's still, so many years later, the impact from the cultures that were mixed together when the Islamic Empire still existed here in Portugal. Mining may have been one of the first industries to develop in Portugal and Spain, but very soon after, agriculture and fishing were developed in these areas. And so there's just so many dishes in the Portuguese traditions that are around the sea, because of course it has a coastline down its entire western side, the Atlantic, and the basis of its most famous dishes are cod or bacalhau. So you have cod fritters and you have cod in a lot of dishes here in Portugal. The whole fishing industry is just central to the Portuguese history and their identity. So you have Rome introducing what is called Latin vulgar language. Vulgar just means popular. And of course, Latin is the basis of all the Romance languages. Portuguese is a Romance language, as is French and Catalan and Spanish. What we now know as Portuguese, the language starts to develop once the Romans are there. Before, obviously, other language had been spoken, and since then, other languages have been spoken, obviously. In the north, it's really interesting. Here in Portugal, people speak English more easily than they speak Spanish. And I think that's fascinating because they're so close to Spain. But in the north, there is a language in between Portuguese and Spanish. It's called Gallego. And in the province of Galicia of Spain, they speak Gallego. And so it's literally between Spanish and Portuguese. So if you speak Spanish, you can understand it. And I'm assuming that if you speak Portuguese, you can understand it. I thought that was fascinating. So going back to the Reconquista. So in about 1249, the Reconquista of Portugal is complete, and in 1255, Lisbon is named its capital. It was the Romans who set up the first settlement here called O Lisboa, and of course that then eventually becomes Lisboa, the current name in Portuguese for Lisbon. Also interesting that very soon after, in 1386, you have a treaty with England. So there's been a treaty of alliance between Portugal and England for hundreds and hundreds of years. I mean, 1,000 years almost. Pretty amazing that these two countries come together. And why do they come together? Because they have a common enemy. Spain has tried to invade Portugal several times. And the British have also come to love a product that Portugal will be famous for, the sweet wine port. And so there are many British port companies here, and you can see them across the river in the north. But in any case, the name for Portugal is a combination of Portus Gallia. And so that in the north was what the Romans called that area. And so Portugal is a derivative of the name for port and an area called Gallia, but we'll talk about that later. In 1415, that Portugal begins its outward expansion. So it's only been 200 years since it's even been a country, a nation, and yet its kings understand clearly that they don't have resources, they don't have what they need to build their kingdom, and so they start looking southward. And so at 1415, the king with his sons attack the North African city of Ceuta, and through a combination of luck and poor decisions on the opposing side, they are able to take the city of Ceuta. And so Portugal begins its African expansion in 1415. Long before any ships from Spain would go anywhere, Portuguese really do start the expansion of colonialism, conquest, and empire in Africa. So soon after the conquest of Ceuta, the Portuguese start to explore the western coasts of Africa, and by mistake they get thrown off in a storm and find the islands of Madeira, and soon Azores, and soon Cap Verde, and all of these islands are in the Atlantic, the western coast of Africa, and they quickly become colonized, and Portuguese start to bring people who will inhabit the islands and start to grow products landmarks on them. As they're doing that, they're also looking at different parts of Western Africa. They are going into what is now Angola and Ghana and other places. And again, completely by accident, thrown off in a storm, they go 1,200 nautical miles to the west and hit upon Brazil. So there are maps from the early 1500s, even late 1400s, that show that the Portuguese had already been to a lot of what we now consider South America. And also in the late 1400s, they'd already gone around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. Henry the Navigator, the famous king from Portugal, is said to have constantly told his admirals, just a little bit farther, just a little bit farther. And why did they want to go farther? Because remember, Venice and Genoa had the complete monopoly on the spice trade. So this was really the riches at that time. Spices were very expensive, but they were much needed. In a time when you don't have refrigeration, in a time when food can't really keep, you have to have spices, not just salt, but things like pepper and things like cloves and cinnamon and all sorts of spices that came from the East. And that's what made Venice so very rich, and it made Genoa rich as well. And so the Portuguese said, if we can just get to India, then we can also bring all of that luxury and riches back. And they eventually did. It took them about 100 years, but they eventually got to India, and through both piracy and basically out and out lies, they were able to establish outposts in India, and also realized that because there was a whole route of traders from all of the Mediterranean and the Islamic empires, there was a safety assumed because there were treaties in place with all of these different empires, and they realized that the Arabian boats, the trading boats, were not armed. So unlike the Portuguese that always had the caravelas armed to the teeth, the Arab traders were not armed. And so what they started to do was they started to simply steal all of the goods that were in these Arabian trading vessels. And so a lot of the items that are first brought back to the Portuguese court were just stolen. So I think it's important to point that out as well. So as the Portuguese are exploring Africa, also in 1440, the first 250 enslaved peoples from Africa are brought to Lisbon to be sold for the first time. So it's not to say that slavery didn't exist. Slavery absolutely existed. But what we know as the transatlantic slave trade that would claim millions of lives and millions of people would be affected begins in 1440 with those first 250 enslaved persons from Africa that are brought to Lisbon and sold as slaves in Lisbon. So the Portuguese are said to have used Catalan maps that get them past the Cape of Good Hope in 1488 and eventually to India. But as Portugal is growing in its prestige and in its wealth and in its territories, Portugal is making treaties and trading agreements with different groups in Africa as well as in the Far East and in India. So it's growing very, very rich, but it's also having real problems. So there are, of course, plagues, because one of the things that happens when you bring in goods and spices and people from other lands is that they bring in disease. And in fact, as we all came to know well, the term quarantine, that, as I think I've mentioned before, is the Venetian name for 40 days. And so the cuarentena, the 40 days that ships had to stay outside of Venice to ensure they were not bringing illness into the Venetian port, I'm not sure that that was necessarily practiced in Lisbon because there were real issues. Portuguese were forced to help Spain in the famous Spanish Armada that gets lost off the coast of England. And in 1755, there is an earthquake that destroys most of Lisbon. And so there were real setbacks to the Portuguese Empire as they were building it. And also they had several kings that died without heirs. And so that, of course, throws the country into a civil war as different parties back different candidates to be king. And so that also did not help the stability of the Portuguese Empire. Really interesting because it is the Pope that decides, a Spanish Pope by the name of Borgia, you may have heard of them, of course, who was very close to Isabella of Castile. And so he actually sets the line that will divide the world between Portugal and Spain as they go out to plunder and to take over new lands. And so he gives Spain a greater portion. So I think it's of interest that they basically just split the world and said, this is yours and this is mine. And that's why, in the end, the British also had to turn to piracy, because as Protestants, they weren't going to get anything from the Pope. Also, during the Napoleonic Wars, Portugal was occupied, as was Spain, by Napoleon. And millions of Portuguese, during all this tumultuous time, what they did was that they emigrated. And so they emigrated to Brazil, they emigrated to all of the colonies in Africa, and throughout what was called the New World. Portuguese went to the new countries because of the turmoil and the problems in Portugal. In 1910, there was a revolution, and in 1926, there was a military coup. During the time of Franco in Spain, there was also a dictator in Portugal, and then there was what is called the Carnation Revolution. The Carnation Revolution took place in 1974, and so this government, finally a democratic government, set up democratic institutions and immediately gave independence to all of the colonies that were left in 1975 in Africa and throughout the world. Interesting that the last colony to be recognized by Portugal was only in 2002. That was Timor. You'll remember that Indonesia occupied Timor and East Timor, and Portugal only recognizes Timor as an independent country in 2002. So in 1975, when Portugal gives independence to its ex-colonies, former colonies, that ends 560 years of Portuguese Empire. That's a long time, 560 years. But in any case, countries get their freedom, and a lot of civil wars follow, but Portugal does walk away from their colonies, unlike, for example, France, where North Africa had a bloody civil war, where North African colonies had to fight France to get their freedom. So modern Portugal is a founding member of NATO, and in 1986 joins the European Community. And so it forms part of the countries that are united in a single currency and free movement of goods, people, and trade as the European Economic Union. Portugal was one of the poorest members when it began in 1986, and there were huge investments in education and in healthcare and in housing and in infrastructure. And Portugal now has the highest standard of living in the European community. It's considered the safest country in Europe. It is very well managed, and it's a very safe place. So they call it the Portuguese miracle, but they did things like legalize drugs. So all of the money that was used for jails and for policing and for all that is now used for healthcare and giving services to people who may have drug problems. So it's just a different allocation of resources with really positive results. And I think we ought to look at it. Portugal has continued to break new grounds. It offers now what's called a golden visa for anyone from anywhere. You can have a temporary stay here for a year. You reapply every year as long as you make $2,800 from some other place. So if you are able to work remotely and you want to spend a year here and you make more than $2,800, you can come to Portugal and stay. And many people have come. I mean, they're huge expat communities. In fact, there's an expat community even just from California. So there are many people that have come to take advantage of the great weather, beautiful beaches, very high standard of living. I would say that the prices are maybe a third of what they are. For example, in California, talking about basics like food and rent and things. So just a lot of reasons to come, and a lot of people have come, in fact, millions of people. Portugal has a little under 11 million people, the entire country. So it's not a large country, but close to 15% of the people here now were not born here. And so what that means is that there are lots and lots of people who have come to invest in Portugal and have come to work in Portugal and have come to work remotely from Portugal as well. So this golden visa, Portugal was the first in Europe. Other countries have followed suit, but it has been very beneficial, I think, to the economy. There is an aspect of what is being called overtourism. There are a lot of people everywhere from other countries visiting all over Europe, and this is not just in Portugal, but you see it. And you see the strain, I think, at the height of the tourist season, the strain on the infrastructure because of so many people visiting. But I think the authorities need to make sure that the locals are taken care of. A real housing policy, I think, needs to be put in place, because when people come who are making more money, the average salary in Portugal is under 1,000 euros. So if you're coming in with double or triple that, prices are going to be raised. There's construction everywhere, but there are also a lot of buildings that need fixing, that look abandoned. So I feel like there's opportunity still for the government to come in and say, okay, we're going to build 10,000 units of affordable housing or whatever. There needs to be a real housing policy put in place, because there is so much interest in Lisbon and in Portugal because it's a beautiful city. And now for my favorite part of the video, the book recommendations. So José Saramago is the quintessential Portuguese modern literary figure. He is one of the ambassadors of Portuguese literature. He has a beautiful foundation here in Lisbon. And in 1998, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. So today I'm going to recommend several of his books to you. The first book I'm going to recommend today is called The Stone Raft. What if the Iberian Peninsula cracked at the Pyrenees and started to float towards the Azores? It's a great story, it's a wonderful fable, and a fun read. This is a book by José Saramago, and it's just a wonderful story. What happens when you start to float away, when all of a sudden you're on an island and no longer a peninsula? So it's a fun read, and I recommend it. As always, check your library, check your local bookseller. We love our local booksellers, we love our libraries. And we always, if those are not available to you, we always include links to independent booksellers online in case you'd like to purchase the books recommended. Perhaps Saramago's best-known work is a work called Blindness. What happens in a society, in a town, when all of a sudden everyone starts to go blind? As you can imagine, the structure of society quickly crumbles, and that's what happens in his book Blindness. So it is the story of how a family made up by an ophthalmologist and his wife and people that they help, how do they survive this situation? And don't think it's a bleak book, because it's not, because I'll just tell you at the end, people get their sight back, but what happens in that whole adventure is the story, and it's one of the reasons why he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, because it is a spectacular read, and I highly recommend it. With Saramago, I could go on and on, because he is a prolific author, writer, many books, but today I've just chosen 3 to share with you. I encourage you to take a look at his other books, because there's so much wonderful reading to be enjoyed by Saramago. So the third book is called Death with Interruptions, and this is a book about what happens one day when the Grim Reaper, or La Muerte, or death, decides to take a break. And so all of a sudden, New Year's Day, no one passes away. And of course, at first there are celebrations, because eternal life, who doesn't want that? But then the reality sets in, and what that means for a society. It's a fun book, really interesting, because it takes a look at our humanity, what it means to be human and have a finite existence, and what would happen if all of a sudden we had an infinite existence. Sounds exhausting, but it's a great book, fun read, also highly recommended. Thank you so much for joining us on this joint journey. Thank you for enjoying the content and for commenting. We love to hear what you think about what we share with you, the books that we recommend, what you're reading. Let us know what you're reading. We'd love to know. We'd also like to hear from you what you'd like us to talk about. We've done it before and we'll continue to do it. As you suggest people and topics to discuss, we'll do the research because we enjoy doing that, and we'll put it together for you. We would love you to subscribe to Latina Literati. And as always, we thank you. Con mucho cariño, mucho salud y mucho amor. Gracias.